Hello, 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 hello. Welcome. That's the reception I usually get when I walk into my classes and start my lectures, so it's very familiar. Thank you. I'm Sheldon Brown. I'm the director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, and I want to thank you all for coming here to this event that we're hosting. We're so excited to be able to bring to the UCSD community two of the most celebrated novelists of our time, Kim Stanley Robinson and George R.R. Martin. They're here out of great generosity to help us raise awareness and support for the Clarke Center, and specifically for one of our most important programs that we run, the Clarion Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Writers Workshop. That's right, that's right. So in the Clarke Center, we do a lot of different things. What we're really established to do is to understand, enhance, and better enact the outcomes of the human imagination. And we do this by considering that phenomena of imagination in all of its myriad ways in which it operates. We look at it from its origins as a neurological operation. We look at how it scales up to larger scale brain activity and cognitive behavior, and then to the social and cultural methods by which we explore and act and gather the fruits of the human imagination. And we have a special focus on science fiction and fantasy, how they stretch our considerations of the possibilities of what we may pursue or what we might want to avoid pursuing for ourselves and our world, but also to engender what I think is one of the ultimate values that the arts provides to our species, which is the creation of creativity. And so it's through our experiences of the arts that it engenders within us the ability to recreate our own condition. And we're fortunate that we have an amazing network of authors that we bring to campus regularly for collaborative activities and public programs. So this is, one of the bigger public programs we've done recently. And so if this is one of the first times you're hearing about the Clarke Center, hopefully you'll come back to some of our programs down the road. And the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writing Workshop is one of the most fertile sources for these great writers that we're able to kind of bring to the campus. And not only the ones that have established themselves, but as an incubator of the great writers that are soon to come as they go through the Clarion process. Now, both Stan and George have been affiliated with Clarion as students and faculty for Clarion, and we're grateful that tonight we're going to have the opportunity to hear from them, thoughts on their work, on fiction in general, and I think in a really interesting way, the act of becoming a writer. Now, but before we get into that, I just want to say, I hope you come back to some of our programs. We've got a really interesting program coming up in June. We have the mathematical physicist, Sir Roger Penrose, that's going to be here for a conference on human consciousness. This will be a mind-expanding event for sure. And so check our website, our Facebook, our Twitter feeds for all these details on this. And now what I want to do is introduce Dr. Shelley Strebe, who will be moderating the activities tonight. She's a professor of literature and ethnic studies here and is the UCSD faculty director of the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Workshop.
Thank you, Sheldon, and thanks for your leadership in bringing the Clarion Workshop under the umbrella of the Clarke Center. He did that a few years ago, and it's been flourishing ever since. I'm the faculty director, Shelley Strebe. I'm really excited to be here tonight. We've got a really wonderful program ahead of us, And I just want to say a few words about the Clarion program. So I'm the director of the workshop. Clarion has been in existence since 1968. It's the largest, or it's not the largest, but it's the oldest and most prestigious workshop of its kind in the world. And we have some of the most celebrated writers, some of the most talented writers in the world who come to UCSD for 6 weeks every summer. And they live on campus with the students in tiny little beds in the dorms. And we workshop these incredibly talented writers' stories. And many of them have gone on to win awards soon thereafter. So Clarion has been at UCSD since 2007. Kim Stanley Robinson, who you're about to hear talk, was instrumental in bringing it to UC San Diego. And we're really excited to have both Stan and George R. R. Martin with us tonight. So Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the greatest science fiction writers of all time. He enrolled at the University of California, San Diego in 1970. He received his BA in literature here, and then he went on and got his PhD here as well in 1982. While he was at UCSD, he had the idea of writing a trilogy of books that would explore 3 different pathways that California might take in the future. And that became the wonderful Orange County trilogy. But of course, since then, he's gone on to write many more important novels, the Mars trilogy, Antarctica, The Years of Rice and Salt, Green Earth, 2312, Aurora, and most recently, New York 2140. He's also worked harder than anyone I know on behalf of Clarion and to keep it here at UCSD, and I'm truly grateful to him for that. Our other guest of honor, George R. R. Martin, is also one of the great writers of our time. He's especially well known for his fantasy novels, but he's also written a lot of science fiction, and I highly recommend his science fiction to you. Check it out if you haven't read it. George has been writing since he was a child. He was publishing science fiction short stories just out of college in the 1970s. And then he earned a bachelor's degree in journalism at Northwestern, graduating summa cum laude, and then a master's degree in journalism the following year. His debut novel, Dying of the Light, came out in 1977. And in the 1970s, he also was an editor for a lot of book projects, New Voices in Science Fiction and the Wild Cards series, which I hope some of you know. George also spent most of the 80s writing for Hollywood. He worked on the TV show Beauty and the Beast and also on the reboot of The Twilight Zone. And it was in 1991 that he started writing A Song of Fire and Ice, which of course became the HBO series Game of Thrones, and the rest is history. But George has also authored a lot of other great stories and novels, including Sand Kings, Tough Voyaging, Night Flyers, The Meat House Man, and a lot of others. He's won many awards. He's won Hugos, Nebulas, Locus Awards, and most recently, or maybe not most recently, but notably, the 2012 World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement. We're so lucky to have both of them with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Kim Stanley Robinson and George R. R. Martin. So, we're very happy to have these 2 great writers with us. And we will talk for maybe 40 minutes, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience. You guys have been filling out the little cards, and about 40 minutes in, I'm going to read some of the questions from the cards so that we'll have an opportunity to hear from you the kind of things you want to talk about. But when we were back in the green room, we were talking a little bit about how things have changed for science fiction and fantasy, how in earlier decades it was more of or considered a kind of paraliterary genre, couldn't get any respect. Now suddenly science fiction and fantasy are at the center of the culture. So what do you guys think caused that to happen, and what kind of effects has it had? Do you have anything you'd like to say about that change?
Well, I'm not really sure what caused it to happen, but it certainly has been happening during my lifetime. I mean, certainly when I was young, if they caught you in school reading a science fiction book, they'd take it away from you. Why are you wasting your mind with that crap? Why don't you read Silas Marner? There were no, when I was going to college, there were no college courses in science fiction or fantasy. And if you, depending on what professor you got, if you took a creative writing course, some of them would let you write it, but a lot of them would not. You know, this is creative writing, we're doing literature here, we don't want that genre crap. So you got that, but I have seen those attitudes change. I think even as early as the late 70s, you started seeing courses in science fiction, and mostly in science fiction, not so much in fantasy, popping up at a few universities. I think Bowling Green in Ohio was one of the first, and you know, we heard about the people there doing that. Well, my voice has suddenly gotten much louder and echoier. Yes, I am the voice of God. And today, it's a very different landscape. We have science fiction fantasy writers winning the Pulitzer Prize, winning other, you know, major prizes, winning National Book Awards. Stephen King winning a National Book Award. Even that was controversial, though. There were some writers who did not like that and protested against that bitterly. So things have changed a great deal, and from where I stand, have changed for the better. But the change is still not complete. Even now, you may have a course in science fiction, a course in fantasy taught at your university, but if the course is, you know, Survey of American Literature, there will be no science fiction books in the canon there. There will be no Gene Wolfe or Ursula K. Le Guin or Roger Zelazny or some of the great things. Well, they will not be included with Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Philip Roth and Saul Bellow and the other people. So it's changed for the better, but the change is not yet complete.
So the literary canon, you think, still excludes science fiction and fantasy writers, even though you may have courses in universities that focus on it?
Yes, the official literary canon, such as it is, which is kept alive mainly by academia, I think, still excludes not only science fiction, fantasy, but pretty much all genre fiction. That's also true. You know, you can take a course in mystery fiction and some things, and then you'll get Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and some of the others, but you will not get a Raymond Chandler novel taught at the same time as The Great Gatsby in the same course.
Stan, do you have feelings about this change?
Well, it was an English department thing to a certain extent, as well as what we would call the New York literary establishment. But when you were in the modernist period, one of the things that meant was that there was high literature and pop literature, and high literature was high and pop literature was low. And so it was a kind of a class system, but in any case, a snobbery. And people like to be snobs in a way because it clarifies what's good and what isn't. So, but the thing is that fantasy, Gilgamesh, the first story that we have, that's a fantasy, a really good one. And science fiction, we are now all living in a science fiction novel that we're co-authoring together. So when, on the one hand, you got realism, well, that would be science fiction. On the other hand, you have fantasy, well, that's our dream life, that's the stories that we tell each other every day. There was always a good reason for science fiction and fantasy to be central, but there was a short period of time where you had to be doing what I call domestic realism to be legitimate in the modernist system. But I will say the literature department here at UCSD, all the way back to 1970, which is when I first encountered it, was always extremely welcoming to science fiction crazies like myself, mainly because of the professors that I met, and so it was a matter of accident. And that's a good thing about UCSD, and maybe why UCSD has had so many great science fiction writers come out of it. Not out of the literature department, but at least out of UCSD.
It should be, you know, the division between high literature and low literature, pop literature culture is actually a relatively recent thing in global history.
That's right.
You know, if you go back to, you know, the Elizabethan theater, Shakespeare was not some hoity-toity guy. He was writing for the ground level as much as anything else. He was including plenty of ribald jokes and sword fights and, you know, exciting stuff in his plays that would please the people who were just standing in the pit and eating an onion. Because if you didn't, they might throw that onion. And they were very conscious of audience reaction. I think a lot of the division, and that produced this attitude dates from Henry James and Robert Louis Stevenson. Do most of you know that story from your lit courses? I don't want to bore you if you already do, but
I don't think they know it.
Tell it again.
they don't know it, okay. Henry James and Robert Louis Stevenson had a celebrated literary quarrel at one point, which was brought on by James writing a review of two books, one of which was Treasure Island by Stevenson, and the other which was a book about a young boy. I don't remember the author. It was a book about a young boy in provincial France coming of age, growing up. And James, in this review, contrasted the two books, and he said, "For me, the pleasure of literature is seeing the author's depiction of the world and the recognition it brings in me, and I go through it and I say, yes, he got that right. No, I don't think he's describing that right. You know, the quality that he brings to common shared experiences of people in the real world experiencing real things." And in the case of these two books, he said, well, the Treasure Island is far more accomplished, the prose is better, it's altogether better written, but it's very unrealistic. And he said the French book, despite all of its flaws, is about a child growing up, and that's an experience I have had. I have been a small child trying to come to terms with adulthood, so I have been a child. But I have never been a pirate hunting for buried gold and having sword fights and dealing with the black spot and yada, yada, yada. And so, therefore, even though Treasure Island is a more accomplished book, the French book is a more worthy book. It's a more serious book about a serious subject. And the other one is just sort of fun. Stevenson responded in the next issue of the magazine with a rather famous one-sentence thing here. Mr. James says that he has been a child, but he has never been a pirate hunting for buried gold. Then obviously he has never been a child. And James responded to that, and many other people got involved, and it became a very long literary debate, which the academic and literary establishment of the time subsequently decided that James had won. And from that point on, Stevenson and all of the Treasure Islands and kidnaps and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and all this stuff were sort of consigned to genre literature, kiddie literature, fun for children, but not about serious subjects in the real world. If you want to be a serious writer, you have to write about, coming of age and problems in modern life and, things like that, hopefully as elegantly as possible. And therefore, we had the whole creation of genre literatures, which was accelerated by the growth of the pulp magazines in America, which were all genre magazines. Detective fiction and romance fiction and ranch romances and westerns and Zeppelin stories. They were all very specialized, but they were all pulp, and they weren't serious literature. All science fiction and fantasy writers, all mystery writers, all romance writers were all the literary descendants of Robert Louis Stevenson, while the people who are writing literary fiction are the literary descendants of Henry James. But I think, and I hope, that the two sides, having been separated for a century, are starting to come together again. When they give Stephen King the National Book Award, he's definitely a descendant of Stevenson. And that gives me great hope for the future.
What about the relationships between science fiction and fantasy and their changing appeal, let us say, to mass audiences? You have started out writing science fiction stories. Now you're known as a fantasy writer. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, the choices you make when you choose to write a story in one genre or the other, and what relationships you think there are between them. And Stan, I'd like to hear a little bit about what you think those relationships are too.
Well, that's an interesting subject. Yes, when I started out writing in the early 70s, I did a few fantasies early on. I've been published in fantastic magazines, one of the digest magazines of the day. But predominantly, I published in Analog and Amazing, and the magazines were identified as science fiction magazines. And I wrote a lot of stuff that were set on other planets with aliens and starships and all of that stuff. I think a lot of that was not because I preferred science fiction to fantasy. I loved them both. I mean, I grew up reading Robert A. Heinlein and Andre Norton were two writers that I devoured in my childhood and early teenage years. But I also read Robert E. Howard and Tolkien for the fantasy, H.P. Lovecraft and horror. We didn't call it horror then, we called it monster stories. I love my monster stories. And having read all this, I also wrote all this when I come of age. But in the 60s and the 70s, well into the 70s, there were far more markets for science fiction, particularly in the short story length. So that's predominantly what I write. I love the worlds I created and some of the stories I told. I'm still very proud of. But I look back on it now and saying, I was writing fantasy all along. I mean, I'm not a hard science guy like Stan. Everything that I know about science, I learned from science fiction stories. So, my science fiction stories, if you look at them crookedly here, are really space fantasy. I'm using aliens instead of elves or whatever. It's a furniture difference rather than a quantitative difference. And I actually believe that science fiction and fantasy are just two flavors of the same thing. I mean, one of them is chocolate ice cream and one of them is strawberry ice cream, but they're both ice cream, and they taste really good. Now, there are some people who don't believe that, who feel that they're completely opposite and indeed may even be in opposition to each other, because science fiction is real and realistic and could possibly happen, and fantasy is not, which is a dubious proposition when you think about it, because
it doesn't hold up.
actually there's far more evidence for the existence of ghosts than for hyperspace.
Yeah.
So why don't you tackle that?
The border between science fiction and fantasy is so permeable and interpenetrated that it can never be teased out, and none of the ways that people try to do it actually work very well. So it's a game that we play in our field, and some people will argue over it, and other people realize that it can never be accomplished because time travel is usually called science fiction, and yet it's a fantasy. And every night we are always having about 3 or 4 fantasy novels run through our heads, which are our dreams, and those dreams are real. And so you could say that it's a kind of science fiction where you drop into your dreams every night. And there are other ways in which the borders are permeable. If you set your story 5 million years in the future and there's humans involved, then you have this Clark's law that any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. Very true. Like your cell phone, it's magic. So we're already there, and the distinction between the two is more is unimportant except in publishing terms. And the guy who wrote the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction and the Encyclopedia of Fantasy, John Clute, writing almost every entry in both encyclopedias, if you can believe it, he suggests that we call it all fantastica to distinguish it from domestic realism. And instead of trying to make a distinction that can't be made between science fiction and fantasy, you accept that in fantastica, things that happen that might not happen to you on the street tomorrow and yet are worth writing about and talking about. And in fact, my teacher here at UC San Diego, I was so lucky to have, Frederick Jameson, said to me once, "It's clear to me, fantasy is about pre-capitalist cultures, and science fiction is about capitalist or post-capitalist cultures." And it works like a charm, actually. So it's a game you can play forever.
I see.
You see a lot of that stigma we talked about, that science fiction and fantasy, but science fiction in particular was subliterary, was not real literature. Still has its influences, I think, and you see people denying that they write science fiction when obviously they are writing science fiction. I mean, Margaret Atwood, her classical case here where she denied, no, I'm not a science fiction writer, there are no squids from space in my stories. Yeah. And, she had to be informed that squids from space are not actually necessary, although they're fun. Yeah. And it crops up in the strangest places. I mean, during my television career at one point when Twilight Zone was winding down and Star Trek: The Next Generation was just gearing up. I had an interview at Star Trek: The Next Generation for a possible job as a staff writer, and I remember coming into the office of this producer, who thankfully did not last long on the show, and you can see where when I tell the story. And he said, "Well, I don't know who you are. Can you tell me your credentials?" I said, "Well, I just coming off Twilight Zone, where I worked for a while, but before that, I wrote novels and short stories. I'm primarily a science fiction writer." And he said, "Oh, really? Well, Star Trek is not a science fiction show. It's a people show."
Oh, my God. A people show.
I was fooled by the photon torpedoes and the starship. I was misled. So needless to say, I didn't get that job after, making shameless fun of this idiot. But yeah, the crazy denials that you get just mean, I don't want to be tarred with that brush, but the brush is outdated, and the modern audiences, like I think most of the people in this room, read all this with great enthusiasm and don't think of it as a guilty pleasure or something subliterary, and hopefully that will go away in a few more years.
Didn't Ursula K. Le Guin famously reply to Atwood that, she was just afraid of being stuck in the literary ghetto and that her definition of science fiction didn't really make sense? That's what I'm remembering.
I think she did, yes.
Yeah. What about the worlds that you create? They're so intricate, both of you, in different ways. You're both known for creating these richly detailed worlds. I'm wondering if you do research or what your process is for creating those worlds. Is it something that requires reading or even sketching maps or something of that nature, or do you just dig into the story and start there? And I'm interested in hearing from both of you how you write.
Well, I think ever since folk-toping fantasy does require a map. And fantasy fans expect them. I expect them too. I like maps. I even like real-world maps and all that, but I certainly like fantasy maps in the front of my fantasy books if it's set in a secondary world. David Knight once famously said that he would never read a book with a map in the front, so. So Damon was wrong about a number of things, but as well as being the founder of Clarion and right about things.
Well, Damon is like Chairman Mao, right? 51% of the time, you win.
Particularly with epic fantasy, which of course is what A Song of Ice and Fire is, the setting is very important. Those of you who are in creative writing courses, literary courses, will know about the elements of fiction, and you'll have teachers probably back in high school talk to you about character and plot and theme and all of the different elements that go into the short story. And setting is usually in that list, but it's usually way down on the list. It doesn't get a lot of attention because if you're writing about the real world or the mundane world, as a science fiction writer would say, it's the world that's all around us. You don't have to describe what an office looks in any detail. People know what an office looks, or a living room, or so forth, or they know what you'll find in New York City or a farm in Kansas. But if you're really dealing with totally made-up places, we wouldn't know what the Shire looks like, except Tolkien tells us what the Shire looks like and draws a map, and you see the relations of the place to each other, and you learn a little about its history and how long it's been in place, and that gives a verisimilitude to it that is equal to a mainstream writer just saying, "I was born on a farm in Kansas." You can't do that without doing some world building in fantasy or science fiction to some extent. Tolkien's first breakthrough in America was in the late 1960s. He wrote Lord of the Rings in the 50s, but it was published only in hardcover and only in England. Very few copies made it across the ocean until Ace Book discovered that there was a lapse in the copyright laws, so they pirated it and put out an unauthorized paperback edition, which actually forced Tolkien to license it to Ballantine Books, which put out the authorized edition, and they became enormously popular, particularly with young people, college students of the 60s. And a lot of people I knew had a poster on their wall, a Tolkien poster, but it's interesting me going back, what was that poster? Was it a portrait of Gandalf? Was it, You know, Frodo and Sam walking somewhere. Was it Aragorn with his sword? No, none of those things. It was a map of Middle-earth. That was the poster that sold millions of copies to the students of the 60s. Middle-earth was a character in that book. Middle-earth, the setting was as vivid, as important as everything else. There's been a Tolkien calendar now, which has been going on for half a century. Every year there's a new Tolkien calendar, something that I'm trying to imitate what my Westeros Ice and Fire calendar is, which has been coming out for like 10 years now. But you look at the Tolkien calendar, and even without reading any legends, you know these places. You just have to look at the art that the painters, that the artists are creating. Okay, that's Rivendell. That's Minas Tirith. That's the Shire. Oh, here's one where they're in the mines of Moria. Totally made up places, but we know what they look like. We see an image in them, we instantly recognize them, just as we recognize images of Paris, or Angkor Wat, or you know, any of the places that exist in the real world, the Taj Mahal. Tolkien created his world with such detail that his fantasy places took on a tangible life in our imaginations and live there still. And I think all of the great fantasy books do that. Narnia, we know what Narnia is like. Oz, Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, and hopefully my own Westeros. These places have been built in such detail that they're as real to millions of readers as Thailand or Mexico or, you know, Berlin. And that's terrific as far as I'm concerned. That's very cool, and I think it is necessary, a very strong sense of place and setting for fantasy books. Do you think that's true for science fiction?
To a certain extent, particularly since in science fiction, one of the subgenres that I love the most is the planetary romance, where you go to another planet, and then the joy of it is the same but different, and like Earth but not like Earth. How is it different? And it needs to be specific. And also, if you're doing a novel, and a science fiction novel, so it isn't set on Earth in the present, you have what I call the cardboard sets problem from Star Trek, the cardboard sets. That what you would want to do is compensate for that by a little bit of a hyper-realism, where you add more detail to make sure that you believe in this setting, and it isn't a cardboard set behind some kind of an invention. And then in terms of my own longest novel, there have been stories about Mars for forever. As humans have always been aware of Mars and telling stories about it, but they were always just a made-up space until 1976. To a certain extent, 1969, but the Mariner passed by during a dust storm. So it was 1976 when Mars was handed to us on a platter. So the Percival Lowell, he got it wrong. H.G. Wells, Clausewitz, and Bogdanov, all of the great Martian literature after Percival Lowell said he saw canals, it was all a kind of made-up Mars. Same with Ray Bradbury with Martian Chronicles. It might as well have been Arizona. Same with, you know, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars is Percival Lowell's Mars done over and over again, but they never had the place. And then in '76, then you did have maps, precisely in the sense of satellite maps in great detail. And lo and behold, the place was like but not like. It was like New Mexico on steroids. Everything was 100 times bigger than the earthly feature that was similar to it. So that the biggest volcano on Mars turned out to be 100 times bigger than Mauna Kea. And the biggest canal was 100 times longer than the Grand Canyon. It went on and on like that. There's a Noctis labyrinthus is a labyrinth like you'd have in a fantasy novel. Olympus Mons would stick right up out of the sky, so as you climbed the mountain, you'd climb out of the atmosphere. There's a canyon at what I called the Dover Gate, where you'd be looking down a depth that would be 4 or 5 times deeper than the Grand Canyon at its deepest spot. And it's real, and that's the thing that I found interesting. Real but empty, as spectacular as anything a fantasy novelist could make up, but the next planet out. So that had to be a character, and nobody had the opportunity to do that until '76. And there is indeed a bunch of Mars literature in the 1980s, but I decided to throw caution to the winds and double down on making the landscape a character too.
Which is a really beautiful thing. It's because your work is so complex and intricate, both of you, that I, wondered how it could ever be adapted in other media. Of course, HBO has done a beautiful job with your series, but I wanted to ask you a question about adaptation. So Stan, for a while, Spike TV was planning to adapt Red Mars from the Mars trilogy, which is one of my favorite works of fiction ever. And you were talking to me about it being on hold, but I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little about how you feel about adaptation on the one hand, and whether you think that there's a way in which an adaptation could do a kind of justice to your work. I'm curious. I would like to ask you, I know, George, you worked in Hollywood in the 80s, and so have had more experience kind of working with TV scripts. And I read that you said you were happy that HBO was doing Game of Thrones instead of one of the networks because the story was seen as too sexual, too violent, too complicated for other networks. And, in reading the books and watching the series, I still have to say that I find so much more depth and power in the books. I'm wondering if there are things you wish that they had been able to include that they didn't, or are there things you particularly like, on the other hand, about the way it's been adapted?
Yes, I mean, for most part, Game of Thrones is a magnificent adaptation of A Song of Ice and Fire. But just the nature of transiting from one medium to another, things have to be cut out. I mean, we have 10-episode seasons for everything we've done so far. That's 10 hours. You look at my books, you can't get everything in 10 hours. If you tried to do it literally and included every line of dialogue and every character, you'd be talking 30 hours a season. Now, that being said, I would have liked, and I've said right from the beginning, that I would have liked a few more hours per season. Some of the other HBO shows that went before us, like The Sopranos and The Deadwood, they had 13-episode seasons. So they had 3 more hours. If we'd had just 3 more hours a season, we could have included some of the material that was cut, particularly some of the smaller character scenes that I think would have deepened and enriched the experience. But our show was simply too big. It was already one of the most expensive things HBO did. It was very complex. It's not a show like The Sopranos that you shoot entirely in northern New Jersey. We have 5 crews in some cases that are shooting in Belfast in Northern Ireland, in Morocco, in Croatia, in Spain, in Iceland. It's a huge undertaking, and David Benioff and Dan Weiss, the showrunners and the guy who did most of the work of translating from one medium to another, said to me at a certain point when we were debating this, George, if we had 13 episodes per season, it would kill us. And I like David and Dan, and I don't want them to die, so I stopped saying that we needed 13, but 13 episodes per season would have been good. You're always going to lose things in that process. My novels are gigantic, but even a novel that is not gigantic, it's hard to get all of it into a movie or even a TV show. Before I made the deal with HBO, I had offers from people who wanted to saw the success of Lord of the Rings from Peter Jackson and wanted to make mine into a feature film. And I had meetings with them, but I just sort of laughed. No, there's no way you get all of my stuff into 2.5 hours. So I'm very glad we chose the path we did. And yes, it had to be HBO. You can't put this on CBS. People would die. They would see a boobie and So no, it has to be. It has to be HBO or something comparable, and HBO's been an amazing group to work with. And I'd like to know what happened to the Red Mars thing too, so you should answer the first part.
Well, yeah, I will get to that, but I like the stories where when Game of Thrones is filmed in one of these small countries, it like doubles their GDP for that year. And I'm thinking, 3 more episodes a year or 3 more small countries would be raised out of poverty. It's a beautiful story, and in fact, I was just in Barcelona, where the biggest bookstore in Barcelona is owned by a guy who bought the Spanish rights to Game of Thrones very, very early on when nobody else in Spain was interested. And so He owns the building that his bookstore is in now, entirely from that. And beautiful stories proliferate about the effect that Game of Thrones has had in this world. Now, as for Mars, maybe it's the opposite story. I have, not only has it had 6 or 7 options and then screenplays, each more dreadful than the last, but it's killed entire production companies off. And the most recent one, Spike TV, has been banned from ever trying to do fictional shows ever again. So Spike TV has been returned to the reality TV and whatever else it was doing before. And the Mars trilogy has moved on in its restless movement through the media world. And again, there's interest. Again, I'm dubious. I really have been encouraged when the people doing the adaptations have even read Mars, because several times they haven't. So I'm not exactly lucky. And also, it's a work in progress. It could happen at any time, because many factors have to come together, is I guess the best way to put it.
It's interesting that, you know, TV, having been historically regarded as kind of the lower form than film, is actually more useful for exploring a world in great detail. So it's kind of reminding me of the way science fiction and fantasy's fortunes have changed. It seems like TV is now being seen as something that, you know, you can have really wonderful art and, you know, carry something out for a longer period of time.
Well, it's true that historically, you know, feature films were the highest level in Hollywood, and television was seen as a lower level. So the snob factor that we talked about in the literary canon also exists there. But that's completely changed now. I mean, feature films have come to be the place to go for spectacle. But if you want serious drama and character development and all that, then it's television. We are living, I mean, forget the early 50s. That was the great age. This is the golden age of television. There have never been so many great television shows on. And the quality of a television show, of today's television shows, like Game of Thrones, holds up to any feature film. I mean, we've showed Game of Thrones episodes on IMAX screens, you know, blown up to the size of a football stadium, and it still looks great, which you couldn't say for, you know, I mean, don't put any Star Trek episodes, even the Next Generation, certainly not the original series, on an IMAX screen. It's not going to work that way.
The
but
cardboard.
the special effects, the cinematography, all of the production values of the best television shows are right up there with any feature film. And more directors and writers and actors who previously only did features are now moving into television. So
Exciting.
it's a great new world for people who like television. And there are really more good shows than I can even keep up with.
So I think I'll ask you a question about hierarchies of power now. I see that as a concern in both of your oeuvres. So I wonder if each of you could speak about what insights your work might offer about these big topics, or what questions you might be exploring. More specifically, I was thinking, George, just reading around a little bit about your life, it seems you're from a working class background. I was wondering if that matters when it comes to what you write and how. And I wondered what particular tools fantasy, with its often pre-industrial settings, might offer for thinking about power. Stan, I was thinking a great strength of your work is thinking about global structural inequalities and climate change. And I wondered if you could talk about what tools science fiction might provide to help you think about those big questions.
Go ahead. Good tag on this one.
Something I said to George last night, I'm not a systematic or coherent thinker, and so that's why I'm a novelist. And if I knew what I thought, I wouldn't have a dozen characters in my head arguing with each other. And what I can do is disentangle that clash of voices and turn them into arguments between, like, puppet figures that I come to believe in. It's very much Calvin and Hobbes, in that I'm Calvin, I believe in Hobbes, and Hobbes is if you believe in him, he's way more interesting than Calvin, more wise and more intelligent. And it works like that for a novelist. And being a novelist is a special thing, but it isn't an organized thing. So when I write a novel, I try to give a clear and fair point of view to people that might disagree with each other and that I might disagree with, but they need to have their fair say in the context of the novel. And then it's bigger things, like the plot of the whole trilogy or the plot of the whole series, that when I look back on it, I say, well, maybe that is expressing what I thought or what I believe. But because it's so complicated, it means that it can't be reduced to a simple statement. So we do have climate change. We're already in it. We've already started it. We're going to be living with it for the rest of our lives and beyond our lives into generations to come. Well, if you're doing near future science fiction, it means you have to deal with it one way or another, and it gives you a lot of stories to tell. And I guess that's pretty much where I would leave it.
Well, my books, particularly Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, do deal a lot with the issues of power. In a medieval setting, yes, but you can translate some of those lessons to the real world. I mean, I think we as human beings have some kind of basic drive, some motivations that drive all of us. We all want to love, and we all want sex, and we all want kind of recognition, glory. If you go back to Casablanca, it's all the same old story, a fight for love and glory. And those are all good things. But I also think there's something innate in human beings, which is the drive to have power. And of course, we see it acted out in the Middle Ages, in the Roman Republic, people striving for elected office or for the highest level to be the consul, to be eventually the emperor, killing people to achieve this, poisoning them, stabbing them, leading armies against each other. In modern times, we fight it out with elections. But it goes deeper than that. I mean, I don't know how it is at your university, but at some of the places I've taught, the fight to be chairman of the English department was as bloody as the 100 Years' War.
It's the fight not to be the chair of the English department.
There's a tiny little bit of power, but people still want it. I don't know. There's something innate in us that we like to have the power to tell other people what to do, and we don't want other people to tell us what to do. And hey, that's certainly true of me. I hate people telling me what to do, but I do enjoy telling other people what to do. So, power is an endlessly fascinating subject. And then what to do when you have the power. The whole issue of kingship, and what is kingship about, and what do you do if you're the ruler? This is something that Tolkien, as great as he was at many things, never really dealt with this. I mean, his evil guys wanted power. Sauron and so forth wanted power. And if you put the ring on and became corrupted by it, one of the signs of corruption was you wanted power. So clearly there's something there that says power is evil, and he believed that on some level, I guess. But then you get to the end of the book and you come across, well, Aragorn then was king and he rules wisely and well for the next 100 years. People living a long time in those days, especially if they had a little elf blood or something or other. And the land prospered, because the land always prospered in fairy tales and in things that if you had a good king, the land would prosper, and a true king. If you had an evil king, the land would wither. The king was connected with the land. It's a wonderful myth system. Of course, it doesn't work that way in real life. It's not, being a good king doesn't make you, being a good person doesn't make you a good king or a good president, I think during my lifetime, Jimmy Carter was probably the best person ever to serve as president. Incredibly intelligent, incredibly moral, well-meaning and all that. He was a terrible president. You know, much as I like Jimmy, great guy, terrible president. So in my books, I'm kind of exploring. I mean, ruling, when you get the power, what do? Ruling is hard. Ruling is very difficult. He rules wisely and well for 100 years, Tolkien says of Aragon. Well, what was his tax policy? You know, did he rule over the elves too? Were the elves content to rule over him, even though he was a man? When he sent an order to Rivendell or Lothlorien, did the elves say, "Yes, sir, king, sir"? Or did they say, "Leave us alone, you're not our king"? What did he do about all those leftover orcs? There are hundreds of thousands of leftover orcs in the end. Did he, like, set up little orc schools and try to get them off eating man flesh and become productive members of society? Or did he pursue a policy of organized genocide where he sent people into all those tunnels to completely wipe out the earth? Well, Tolkien never answers any of these questions. And these are hard questions. So my characters have to deal with that stuff. You know, there's no clear-cut good answer or bad answer. You have to, oh my God, I'm the king. I have to make this decision. And no matter what decision I make, some people are going to hate me. So how do I go through it? I love to grapple with these kinds of issues.
Well, I think we've reached the audience question portion, so I will be reading these and will be as surprised as you will to hear them. When creating a universe and beginning a saga, where is the best place to start, or with whom? Also, what race and class combination in Pathfinder do you like to play most often and why?
I've never played Pathfinder.
Me neither.
So I can't answer that. Now, you know, Call of Cthulhu I can talk about, you know, a few other role-playing games I have done, but not that one. You know, you begin at the beginning, although the beginning that you begin at may not be the beginning when the book is finally published. It may take it needs chapters before that. In the case of Game of Thrones, I began with not the prologue, which I wrote sometime later, but with the first proper chapter where they find the direwolf pups in the snow. And where did that come from? It just came. I was writing a totally different novel, a science fiction novel, as a point of fact, and one day I just, from somewhere, got this image of a dead direwolf, mother direwolf, with a few pups around her, still trying to nurse her, even though she's been killed, and finding them. And I knew it wasn't part of the novel I did, but I put aside that novel, followed it where it led. So it came down from on high. Where do you begin?
Well, Homer in media res, Aristotle says that's not bad, and it's useful if you have a thing like the Mars trilogy. Say you go to Mars, the trip there, you're stuck in a Motel 6 for 9 months. It's not that interesting. You get there, you have to build a town from scratch. It becomes like a design fiction or a construction novel. Construction novels are not a genre. And there's a reason for that. So I started with a murder that was maybe, 40 years into the story of the inhabitation of Mars, and it's a kind of a Cain and Abel. You can tell it's a triangle, it's a charged situation, and the murderer is a Machiavel who gets somebody else to do the job, and that's all within the first chapter. Then you go back, and all those characters are ostensibly friendly and have a different set of relationships, but you know what's coming. And so as you read, all these stupid little construction things or little arguments, you know where it will lead, and it gives some tension to those first chapters. You also begin to think you're always going to know what's coming, but I passed through that murder at the end of chapter 5, I think, and then there's chapters 6, 7, 8, really long chapters where suddenly you don't know what's happening, and it's like being shot out of a cannon into unknown space. And many a reader has said, well, I read the second half of the book in a single night because I didn't know what was going to happen next. And it was a good structure. So in media res, Aristotle has the best word, analyzing Homer.
One of our great Clarion writers, Ted Chiang, says write the ending first and write to the ending. Have either of you ever done that? Is that something you would ever do?
I'm doing that now, but it's like building a crossword puzzle. I actually think it's harder than hell.
Seems difficult.
I don't know, it might be a good idea. I see my ending receding infinitely before me, and I'm running after it, but it keeps getting further and further away.
It's like the reflection, the mirage on the freeway.
Let's see what we have here. When writing about a given character, do you attempt to, quote, inhabit them, psychologically, physiologically, etc.? If so, how do you get in the frame of mind?
Yes, I do inhabit them. Odd as it may seem, I am, some of my time I am a dwarf, and some of the time I'm an incredibly hot chick riding a dragon. Some of the time I'm a psychopathic 10-year-old girl, killing people and slitting their throats. So I guess my mood varies, but changing between them is very difficult. I mean, I do not write the chapters in the order in which you read them. If I'm in a Tyrion groove, I will write, 3 or 4 Tyrion chapters, and then say, well, hold on, I'm almost to the end of the Tyrion stuff for this book. I better stop and write about somebody else. But that transition where I stop writing about Tyrion for a while and then I go write 3 or 4 Jon Snow chapters, that's a tough transition because they are very different and they have different voices. They know different people. I have to reread a bunch of the old chapters to remember where they were and what they sounded like. And I usually have a couple false starts when changing. But yeah, I live inside my characters, the viewpoint characters anyway.
Yeah, it's the great joy of writing novels, and it's also a way in which I think character-based fiction differs from the idea that you had to live it, and that fiction is kind of autobiographical, a sort of disguised memoir. So Kerouac, Hemingway, many a person ruined their life trying to have experiences that they could then turn into novels. Fitzgerald as well. So it was a kind of as a young American man here at UCSD in the 70s, the idea of what a novel was supposed to be was obscured to me. But what it really is about is getting out of the way of other voices, of trying to be someone else and imagine the other, and then see if you can make that plausible, because although you can't really ever imagine the other, you can write a sentence. And then the generosity of the reader pops into those sentences and makes the character. So the novelist gets out of the way, tries to be the characters that are the point of view characters. And then it's crucial to have generous readers that are willing to play the game of, okay, that string of sentences is about this other person and not about George, not about Stan. It gets you out of that Jack Kerouac trap of you have to have done stupid things before you can write about stupid things. And since we're writing about, killing orcs or landing on Mars, it would be hard to do that stuff.
Okay, for George, what's your favorite piece of writing that you've ever produced, even hearkening back to your youth?
Yeah, I don't know. That one is like asking a parent, well, which is your favorite child?
Yeah.
Mind you, they all have favorite children. They just won't admit it.
So what's yours?
Some of my favorite children who live in my head, I haven't actually looked at or reread for decades, and probably it would be wise to keep it that way. Obviously, A Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire is going to be what I'm remembered for. If I'm remembered for anything, it's my magnum opus. But it's not finished yet, and therefore I'm still nervous about, will I stick the landing here? Will I bring it in as powerfully as I hope to bring it in and make it a complete work of art with a beginning, middle, and end? That's my goal. I have done other things that I have finished. I mean, I started out writing short stories, and a lot of my short stories, I produced some stinkers and some that were kind of mediocre, but I also produced some that I'm very proud of. A Song for Laia, my first Hugo winner. Sand Kings, which oddly enough I didn't think much of when I wrote it, but went on to become until Game of Thrones, my most popular work and the one everybody knew me for, Sand Kings. A few of the more obscure stories like This Tower of Ashes or The Stone City, I think my science fiction is the best it got. Some of my earlier standalone novels, Fever Dream, will always have a very special place in my heart. And the Armageddon Rag, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with that novel because I was very proud of it. I still am proud of it. I think it's an important novel. I'm glad I wrote it. It almost destroyed my career. No one bought it, and I couldn't sell any novel after it. So it changed the course of my life in some huge and fundamental ways. But nonetheless, I still have a affection for that.
Do you have a favorite of yours, John?
It is a hard thing. From what I said just before about trying to get out of the way of a story and imagine that you're another, I wrote a novel called The Years of Rice and Salt, in which all the Europeans died in the Black Death, and then world history went on. So there's a chapter in that called The Widow Kang. It's about a Chinese woman. It's from her point of view, Qing Dynasty. The year is 1776, which is a private joke because they don't have that calendar anymore. When I look back and read The Widow King, I don't know where that came from. It is the most not me, and so I'm extremely fond of it and proud of it.
Okay. Who do you think, or who is supposed to be, the most controversial, conflicting character? I guess this is in Songs of Fire and Ice, Game of Thrones. Like, who are we supposed to be most confused about rooting for? From Esther. So I guess Esther
good
wants
question.
to know.
I hope you're confused about all of them, and I believe in great characters. I love great characters much more than stock hero and villains. A lot of fantasy, in particular, is about the battle of good versus evil in the world. And I think that's a very valid theme for fantasy fiction, or indeed for any type of fiction. But in my opinion, the battle between good and evil is not waged between armies of really ugly people who wear black clothing and some really good-looking people who wear white clothing. It's waged in the individual human heart every day. And all of us have good and evil in us. All of us have the capacity to be heroes and also the capacity to be villains. And indeed, most of us are both during our lives. We've all done, I think, heroic, selfless, noble things for other people, things we're proud of. And if we're honest with ourselves, most of us have also done some selfish things, some things we're ashamed of, some despicable things. And what will we do tomorrow? What will we do when we are really put to the test? That's what interests me. That's what fiction is all about. And I'm putting all of my characters to the test and seeing which ones rise to the occasions and which ones fall. And that's not true of Ice and Fire. That's true of all of them.
Okay, for both of you, how do you juggle so many storylines while writing your books?
With increasing difficulty. There are days that I sit in front of my computer and reviewing all my files and notes and character sheets and remembering all these millions of characters that I've invented, and I say plaintively, did it have to be 7 kingdoms? The 5 kingdoms of Westeros, that would have been enough, right? 5 is a good number. Why did I have to make it 7? But, once having thrown the balls in the air, I am compelled to keep juggling. So I do the best I can. But it is hard. I didn't know when I began this that I would be, I started writing this in 1991. I thought, okay, a trilogy, 3 novels, 4 years, 5 years, I'll be done here. It should have all been done by 1996. 1996 is when the first book came out. So here I am all these decades later, and I'm still working on it.
Yeah.
It's consumed me and transformed my life, hopefully in many good ways. But it's huge, and it is hard to keep track of all of them at times. That's maybe why I'm slowing down from the pace I had at the beginning. Also, this stuff about getting older. I don't recommend that. Don't get older.
Yeah.
It sucks. I'm waiting for the science guys to come up with that youth serum that they've been promising us to reverse the effects of aging and so forth.
The longevity treatment. I get out a big long sheet of butcher paper and a bunch of colored pens, Sharpies, and I make a map of a novel with the characters as the colored pens and try to, because it's too much to hold in my head. And pretty soon I'll see patterns, or I'll see where I've dropped a thread and need to, and so I make it as I'm writing to kind of help myself figure it out. And in fact, in my most recent novel, which is it has a mystery plot in it, so I decided to sketch the mystery because I couldn't understand it. And by the time I was done with the butcher paper and the colored pens, and it looked like the cat had actually gotten into the colored pens, it was a complete morass of arrows and circles. And I've heard that Raymond Chandler, the Big Sleep or the Maltese Falcon, that if you actually try to unpack the plot, you can't understand it. It doesn't make sense. And I was looking at my plot going, this isn't even a mystery novel ultimately. It just has a mystery in it. This is crazy. And so I find drawing and then cutting. It helps to keep track.
Do you do anything like that, or is it all in your head?
Well, I have charts and maps and computer files that I review from time to time. Maybe not as many as I should have. In my earlier novels, I did keep it all in my head. So
Right.
when I started this, not knowing how big it would be, I did the same thing. But at some certain point, it got away from me, and I forget things, especially when I'm, away from actually working on it for a while, and then I have to review to go into it. I will say that that I don't know how Tolkien did it, but my series would not have been possible without the computer. I mean, I wrote all of my earlier novels and most of my short stories on a typewriter. And if I had written this on a typewriter, I would have gone mad. I mean, it's the only way I can keep any of this straight is that wonderful search and replace function that you use. I can just search for a character's name to find out what color eye he had. Although I'm beginning to wish I had never described what color eyes anybody had. This is one of those things that takes place in fiction. We always find out what color eyes people are. I don't think people really know that in real life. I mean, I'm sitting here looking at you. I'm not that far from the first row. I can't tell what color any of your eyes are. It's insane, but we always use it for fiction, and we bring that. And I'm constantly getting that wrong, and the damn readers notice. They send me, wait a minute, you said Renly's eyes were blue, and now they're green in the second book. So then in the third book, I have Renly's eyes were blue-green, and depending on the color of the light.
Yeah.
I also have a horse that changes sex between books, but I wasn't able to explain that one so, notably.
Well, we have a question about influences, and they are wondering who are the important influences on each of you, and then they ask George, they say they have knowledge that you have listed both Lovecraft and Faulkner among your influences, and how do you square the tension between their purple and spare prose?
Wait.
Which one is purple
yeah.
and which one is spare?
Wait, which one is spare? Faulkner and Lovecraft?
Yeah.
There's not much spareness there.
There's no spareness there.
There is no spare there.
No.
Faulkner's influence on me, while I read his books, I haven't read all of his work by any means, but I read some of it. But the greatest influence that Faulkner has had on me is his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which, if you haven't read it, you can find it online. And it's a very moving speech about the kind of writing he was doing and what he thinks fiction should be about. And in particular, he said the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. And I've taken that particular phrase as kind of a mantra for my work. And that's where I think all of this stuff about genre is unimportant, because if it is a important work, we are all writing about the human heart in conflict with itself, whether it's on a spaceship or inside a medieval castle in some fantasy land, or whether it's in suburban Chicago in a mainstream novel. Doesn't matter. We're telling stories about the human heart in conflict with itself, and I think Faulkner nailed it there. And that's the influence. Lovecraft, I think was the greatest horror writer who ever lived. He's certainly one of the big three. He's right up there with Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe. There are many other good horror writers, but nobody approaches those three. And he just scared the bejesus out of me when I encountered his work at the age of 13 or so. And I still do occasionally when I reach for a scary effect in a book or a story. I reach for Lovecraftian effects. He's a writer I've sometimes tried to echo or write like. I don't think I can. I'm not, I don't have the deep level of insanity I think that drove some of his best work. But yes, he did have a huge influence on me, along with science fiction and fantasy writers. I mean, Tolkien, Robert E. Howard on the fantasy side, Fritz Leiber to a certain extent on the science fiction side, Robert A. Heinlein, Andre Norton, who was another writer that I read, when I was quite young. I think the biggest influences you are the people you read when you're young. I mean, I'm 68 years old now. I read many books that are good and I admire them, but they're not going to influence me. I'm not going to find a new writer. Oh my God, this guy, I've got to try to do what he's doing here. No, the influences are all in your formative years when you're still vulnerable to influences.
Yeah. Well, and once you're a working novelist past the age of learning the whole the thing, what you want is to get weirder and more like yourself, and have less influences and more strangeness. But for me, I discovered science fiction here at UCSD in my freshman year, and it blew my mind, and it explained Orange County to me, my childhood home. And I realized that science fiction was the best description of the way the world felt that I had ever run into. And so this was fall of 1970 and then the year of 1971. And the new wave was sweeping science fiction. Actually, it had swept it about 5 years before, but it meant every single one of the great new wave books was in print or about to be printed and in paperback for a quarter or 50 cents. There was a used bookstore down where the baseball stadium is now that had all these books, and I started reading them voraciously. My UCSD career as a history major was trashed because I didn't care. And I had a double major, all right, science fiction, and then later I limped into the literature department as a way to justify it. So the new wave, and that means Ursula K. Le, and what that means is not the people who were called New Wave in those years, but everybody writing between 1965 and 1975 was caught up in this ferment. And so if you just pick a science fiction text between 1965 and 1975, you're going to have an interesting book on your hands, and there's no doubt about it. So Ursula K. Le Guin, Gene Wolfe, Tom Dish, Roger Zelazny, Samuel R. Delaney, Joanna Russ, extremely important, Kate Wilhelm, and but also Jack Vance or Poul Anderson, who were a bit older writers, Silverberg. They were writing, and they got hot from 65 to 75 because the younger writers were also boggling their minds, and suddenly you could write about sex, drugs, and rock and roll and put it in the future, and it was going to be science fiction. So the new wave was what I've always loved, and like you say, it's what hit me when I was young. It's what I wanted to do.
Let's see, I think we've got two for George. I'm going to ask them both to you together. Who would you want to see on the Iron Throne, dead or alive? You can think about that one. Then, whose death do you regret the most?
Who would I like to see on the Iron Throne? Well, I'm not going to reveal that. You're going to have to keep reading the books and find out there. That's a little too much. You guys argue about that. Whose death do I regret the most? John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy.
Okay, I have one final question for both of you. So, what are you most excited about in the field of science and fiction and fantasy today? What excites you about where the field's going? Do you have particular writers you think everybody should be reading?
there's a lot of writers coming in. Science fiction has conquered the world from this little ghetto genre that you weren't supposed to associate with. We've taken over the world. We've taken over television. We've taken over movies. Most of the highest-grossing movies of all time are science fiction, fantasy movies, comic book movies, and all that. And as a result of that, of course, more and more people are entering the field, and there are some extraordinary new talents that are coming up, and that's all very exciting to me. Admittedly, there's so much of it that I often feel like I can't keep up, just because there are so many new people entering. There was a time, once upon a time, when certain science fiction fans, like Forrest J. Ackerman, were able to read every science fiction book published in a year. All the magazines, all the novels, he read them all. But even by the 70s, when I broke in, you couldn't do that any longer. But then there was another time, like 20 years, where, there was a lot of books being published, a lot of stories. You couldn't read them all, but some of them you knew were more important than others, and you could kind of keep up with the important parts of the field. You can't do that anymore either. The field has diversified so much in terms of genres and subgenres. I mean, we have epic fantasy and high fantasy and dark fantasy and urban fantasy, and we go on with that. Science fiction. We have the cyberpunk movement, and the new wave is pretty well gone, but it left its residues on the shore. We have the new space opera, the new weird, all of these things, and you can just read in one of these subgenres and still have more books and more writers and more stories to read than you ever had before. One of the things that is exciting to me is the fact that not only is the field becoming more diverse in terms of subject matters and subgenres, but it's becoming more diverse sexually and ethnically and nationally. We're seeing more and more, I don't want to say that they've never been there. There have always been women writing science fiction, and some great ones. Andre Norton, one of the formative writers of my own youth, was actually Alice Mary Norton. And you had Lee Brackett and C.L. Moore, two incredible writers of the Golden Age. And there was a huge influx of women in the 70s. But today it's many more. It's exponentially larger. And we're seeing more and more writers from other countries. Cixin Liu won the Hugo Award, the first translated novel. He's a Chinese writer in China. Three Body Problem won the Hugo Award. First time a translated novel has ever won. And in the same year, a Dutch writer for a translated novelette, I believe, also won. So we had two translations. Science fiction has conquered not only the United States, but the entire world. I mean, books are being published in all these countries, and they're largely American and to a lesser extent British books. But now, for the first time, we're getting a reciprocation on that. We're getting their visions as well as them getting our visions. So I think all that is tremendously exciting.
Well, I share these sentiments. We come from a time when science fiction was looked down on, and so I personally have a chip on my shoulder that will never go away. And I like to punch people who don't like science fiction. And yet now we are all living in a science fiction novel that we are co-writing together. It's called Reality, so the predictions came right. And because of the work of people like George, it's really central to the culture. People talk in terms of Game of Thrones because everybody's read it or seen it and can understand each other's references. And that is a very heartwarming experience. And then in terms of new writers, I think one of the things that happens is it's harder to look down the generations to new work than it is to look to the generation right before you, which is so incredibly vivid to the mind as a reader. But I will say that I see, when I test out the waters, because I'm always trying to not know what's going on so that I can do my own thing without fear of learning anything from anybody else. I would say that when I talk about younger writers, I see great work by Jonathan Lethem or Cory Doctorow or Paolo Bacigalupi, also Kelly Link or Nora Jemison or Nnedi Okofor. And almost all these people are probably nearly 50 years old. So my
Yeah,
sense of
those are 2 generations back.
Yeah.
There are newer new people than
There are, but I
those
don't.
new people.
Those
Some of them
are
from Clarion, eh?
those are in a mist to me, in that I have not explored the latest work being done. I'm confident it's out there and that it's great, and it's, you know, that's not really my job as a reader. I'm still reading Daniel Defoe with immense pleasure. So, you know, I'm a little off the cutting edge, but I love it all.
I'm really excited about all the amazing work that's come out of Clarion in the last few years. Alyssa Wong and Sam Miller, Carmen Machado, so many people just
Yeah.
producing amazing work. So rush out and read work by all those people if you
Yes.
haven't heard of them. Well, thank you, gentlemen. This has been a wonderful evening. And I want you all to stay in your seats because we're going to give them a big round of applause and let them depart. And then we're going to have our raffle to give away the signed books. So please join me in giving a big hand to
Thank you all. Keep reading.
George.
So are we ready to do our raffle? All right.